and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et re-bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel, and this evening I will be doing a dual review for Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion make up the first half, or the first arc, of the Hyperion Cantos, which is a series which comprises 4 books in total, the other 2 books being Endymion and The Rise of Endymion, which I haven't read. Hyperion was published in 1989, and the Hyperion Cantos is one of these big works of epic science fiction. I think some people would just straight up classify them as space operas, but I'm not entirely sure what defines a space opera, if I'm being perfectly honest, so I just call them epic science fiction, which is how I would classify the Duneverse Chronicles, or something like the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. So to me, the Hyperion Cantos is one of the big 3, I guess. I'm not saying there aren't other big epic works of science fiction, of classic science fiction, but I basically know the Dune books, the Hyperion Cantos, and Foundation, and I've read 2 of the 3. Epic science fiction, or perhaps epic science fantasy. Some people consider Dune to be science fantasy, and I do understand where those people are coming from, because I think that I would also classify it as science fantasy overall. I mean, the entirety of the series. There are strong spiritual sub-themes and potentially metaphysical elements, maybe because there are discussions surrounding the nature of consciousness, God, the potential nature and or existence of God, and things like that. So as such, I do think it kind of veers into science fantasy more than science fiction stricto sensu, basically. Hyperion tells the story of 7 pilgrims in this, I guess, galactic empire called the Hegemony, going to a planet named Hyperion to visit something called the Time Tombs, and this pilgrimage is sponsored by something called the Church of the Shrike. The Shrike being this very strange monster type thing, very scary looking, with lots of spikes coming out of its body, bright red eyes, seemingly half machine, half organic creature. And these pilgrims are selected by the Church of the Shrike, but also by this hegemony's government. And each of these pilgrims has a very specific personal reason as to why they petitioned the Church of the Shrike and the world government to be put on this pilgrimage to the Time Tombs. They're all related by something in common, which has to do with this planet Hyperion and its weird monuments, which are the Time Tombs and this whole thing surrounding the Shrike. And so they're traveling together. And what's special about Hyperion is that it's told in a way that is apparently similar to the way the Canterbury Tales are told. Now, I've never read the Canterbury Tales, so I can't really comment on that similarity or not, but everyone says this, so I'm assuming it's true. Basically, each pilgrim has a point of view as they're telling their own story and explaining why they wanted to get to Hyperion and be put on this pilgrimage to the Time Tombs. But there's also a main narrative unfolding, which is this pilgrimage going on with those 7 characters and then progressively getting closer to the Time Tombs and potentially the Shrike monster. And there's a wider context outside of this, of things unfolding and happening in this galactic, I call it a galactic empire, but it's not an empire, it's more of a galactic democracy, sort of. So things going on with the galactic government of the hegemony, which then, gets amplified and much more prominent in the follow-up, The Fall of Hyperion, where the style of the storytelling is a lot more traditional. It's a straight-up novel with a fairly linear progression, and a lot of things happen. I mean, I don't want to spoil Hyperion, I certainly don't want to spoil The Fall of Hyperion, but a lot of things happen in The Fall of Hyperion. It's a lot more action-packed, a lot more intense. The stakes are very high, as they should be in such a work of epic science fiction / science fantasy. Both books are multiple points of view stories, which is, well, my preference really. In The Fall of Hyperion, you find all of the characters you had in Hyperion, plus a few more characters, some of which become very, very important to the unfolding of the story and the resolution of its main narrative arcs. And then Hyperion, by virtue of the fact it features different individual narratives belonging to different subgenres, it'll feature slower-paced stories and faster-paced stories, whereas I would say The Fall of Hyperion is significantly faster-paced. The stakes are very high, there's a lot of action, but there's a lot of reflection and deep thinking going on as well. Very big themes, and like I said, high stakes, and a lot of things are going on. And then as to the prose itself. I thought that these books were very well written. There's some beautiful, quite evocative passages, fairly poetic in nature, but then that kind of makes sense given that the poet John Keats is kind of a central leitmotif of Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion. In fact, I didn't personally know this, but perhaps some of you do. The Hyperion Cantos is a poem or a couple of poems. Yes, because there was Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion. They were a couple of poems that John Keats started and never finished. So that is a direct reference to the poetic work of John Keats. So John Keats is an important figure in this story. I love the many literary references interspersed throughout the books, including, of course, the main one of John Keats's work and John Keats himself as a writer, and just more generally artistic, historical, cultural references. I always enjoy that. And beyond that, I have nothing particular to say about the dialogues. I thought they were good. The monologues as well. A good balance between the two of, like interior monologuing, narration, and dialogues between the characters. And I also enjoy the fact that I thought the author did a really good job of conveying different styles of speech, of thought throughout his individual narratives in Hyperion, but also through things like an AI speaking. Without going into spoiler territory, you do have AIs or AI-related characters. More so in the Fall of Hyperion, at some point you do have this AI construct, and it talks in a very strange way, but it's convincing because it's supposed to be strange. I mean, it's a computer intelligence, so you would imagine that it'd be different from a standard human intelligence. So the way it talks was weird, but very convincing. And a tiny little anecdote, I just found it so kind of ridiculous, but very funny. You have this AI just going into very philosophical stuff, but then when it laughs, because it laughs a lot as well, it goes, "Quats!" And it was just so random, but very amusing. Quats. Quats is the way it laughed. So instead of saying, haha, it went quats. I was like, okay. We have a varied cast of characters in Hyperion, mostly male characters, although the female character was a human being, not a stereotype. So very good characterization, varied characterization, just characters from very different walks of life. You have a decorated general in the hegemony army. You've got a philosophy professor. You have an actual poet from Old Earth. I'll get back to that. You have a private detective. You have an ambassador and a Catholic priest. Just very different characters. And also the priest of a more nature-based, tree-worshipping sort of religion, or nature-worshipping religion. So very different characters with very different backgrounds. And you go in depth into the background of each character, especially in Hyperion, because they each tell you their life stories so as to get to the explanation as to why they chose to go on the Shrike pilgrimage. You get very, very close to them, very emotionally intimate with them. So I really enjoyed that. I don't think it's specifically character focused, because I think a lot of focus is also given to world building, to theming, but the character work is very strong. It's not classic science fiction in that sense, if you get what I mean. Like, the character's not put to the side. The characters are an integral part of the story, of the storytelling, even of the theming, because the theming also has to do a lot with humanity and the nature of humanity and things like that. I said that Hyperion has more male characters than female ones. However, in the Fall of Hyperion, that's still the case, but you have an additional female character who's very, very important. So, like, feminism is not at all relevant to these books, and that's perfectly fine, but contrarily to Doom, the female characterization was perfect. I had absolutely zero issues with it. No sexism, no stereotyping, no cringy sex. I mean, there is sex in these books, but there's a reason for it, so that was fine to me. No cringy romance. The female characters were human, very important, and just as important and well fleshed out as the male ones. And overall, a good balance of grayer characters and just straight up good, decent characters. It's definitely less nihilistic in tone and in theme than the Doomverse Chronicles were. You have legitimately great characters. I don't really think you have outright evil ones, but you do have genuinely good people. One of the characters, Saul Weintraub, not sure how to pronounce his name, was the philosophy professor. He's a really good man. He's a genuinely good person. So you do have good characters and greater ones. So overall, I cared about these characters. I had a much higher emotional investment in these books, in the story, than I did with the characters in something like Dune. Moving on to the world building, like I said, I want to keep this as spoiler-free as possible, so just going to touch on elements of the world and whether I thought they were well realized or not. So just like Dune and something like Foundation, as far as I know and understand, the Hyperion Cantos features I don't know if it's strictly speaking galactic, but I guess multi-planetary. It's not quite an empire, it's a democracy, but just a collection of federated planets populated, colonized by humanity over about a period of, 600 years? This is called the hegemony. Now, as far as I understood it, at first, human beings, when they still lived on Earth, just colonized different worlds and were isolated until they discovered a way of traveling through space that was a lot faster. So that period is called pre-Hegira, and then I guess enough humans decided they wanted to unify all of these worlds, and that became the hegemony. But the hegemony is not really an empire like you find in Dune. It's not a future feudal society. It's mostly democratic, I guess. I mean, loosely democratic with the Senate, and then there's a CEO, which is like the president, I guess. It's fairly capitalistic as well, just by the usage of the word CEO to denote the leader of this democracy, and there's a lot of commentary on consumerism. And the worlds that make up this hegemony are very varied, ecologically speaking. At first, you kind of get the sense that when they were first colonized, they were colonized by people of a single or just a couple of cultures. So a lot of these planets have names which reflect the earthbound culture of its colonizers, its inhabitants. You have a planet called Fuji, so I guess populated by people of Japanese descent, and so on and so forth. You have a planet which basically houses the universe's Catholics, a planet for the Jews of humanity, and things like that. So that was interesting. It was well done. It was convincing world building in that regard. Something that helped humans colonize worlds and unify the worlds is the Farcaster system. So human beings don't just have to rely on space travel, which has gotten significantly faster with a certain update in technology, but still incurs, time debts. And if you leave for a planet, when you come back, 5 years will pass on your home planet and things like that. So they have Farcasters, and Farcasters are basically portals that punch a hole in the fabric of space-time, so you can step through a portal on X planet and end up light years away on another planet, and there is no time debt. And there's also kind of an equivalent for communication, which is similar to like the Ansible in the Ecumen series by Ursula K. Le Guin. So that's very important to the structure of the hegemony and to the development of the story in the Hyperion Cantos. And you have AIs. So whereas in Dune, they've kind of gotten rid of the AIs are very prominent in the hegemony and the Hyperion Cantos. The AIs have basically seceded from human society, but they still work with humans, provide them with lots of services, including the Farcasters. The AIs were the ones to discover the Farcaster technology, and human beings don't actually understand how it works. But the AIs being independent and having a quiet consciousness are, you quickly come to realize, kind of doing their own thing and potentially plotting for nefarious things. But I'll leave it at that. And so you have these hybrids I mentioned between AIs and humans, cybrids, which are AI constructs housed in fully human bodies grown from like DNA. So it's a human body with a human brain, but the consciousness inhabiting said body is actually an AI. So when the body dies, the AI survives. And you do get mention of like alien species, but what's very sad is that the vast majority, if not all of the alien species ever discovered by the hegemony were wiped out because they were seen as competition for the supremacy of human beings, and also the human beings just destroyed a lot of ecosystems when they colonized the corresponding planets housing those ecosystems, which ties in obviously to very poignant commentary on ecological balance, ecological destruction, etc., which I'll get to in a minute. Religion is definitely something that's present in the Hyperion Cantos, theme-wise and world-building-wise. You do have this thing called the Church of the Shrike, which isn't that big. Like, the majority religion is something called Gnosticism, which is more spiritual than actually religious. You still have Catholicism surviving on its own planet. You have something called the Templars, and they live on this beautiful planet reminiscent of the Planet Pandora and the movie Avatar. We have these ginormous trees growing, and they're all about ecological conservation and saving native species. So yeah, they're nature-worshipping people. We have the Church of the Shrike. It doesn't worship this monster, the Shrike, as such, but they believe that the Shrike is an agent of divine retribution, basically, there to punish the sins of humankind, and is supposed to spur human beings towards seeking forgiveness for the sins. And you have the Shrike, which I've mentioned, but I can't say too much about the Shrike or the Time Tombs without getting into spoiled territory. So suffice it to say that the Shrike, big, scary, monstrous entity that can potentially bend space-time and is terrifying and is made of blades and liquid metal and organic matter. You don't really know what it is, and it's not really a spoiler. Just don't expect hard answers about this thing by the end of the Fall of Hyperion. And finally, I'll mention the Ousters. What's cool about humankind in the Hyperion Cantos. So you have two big branches of humanity by the time of the story of Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion. Planet Earth has been destroyed, so most humans live on planets and have heavily modified the ecosystems they discovered upon colonizing these different planets. But then you have a branch of Earthlings, humans, who decided to forego that approach and instead modify their own bodies to adapt to an interplanetary environment, so basically a space environment. So they live in these weird floating cities with asteroid farms, with like containment fields to preserve atmosphere and things like that, and their bodies are heavily genetically modified. They look almost like therianthropes with animal body parts, fur, scales, wings. So it's interesting to have these two different visions of the progression of humankind into the future. One is colonizing other planets and changing those planets to suit them to humankind's needs, and the other one is changing human beings to adapt to a wider galactical environment. I assume that you get more of that in the following books in the Hyperion Cantos, but you still get a good chunk of this in the first arc I read, and it also kind of presents aliens, which aren't really aliens, they're just modified human beings, so, you know, it was neat. The Hyperion Cantos is very rich in themes. I'm just gonna go through the different themes I personally thought I encountered in these books. First, one you might have guessed given the literary reference and the fact that the series name is derived from a poetical work by John Keats, is the relationship between creator and creation. It's done on a couple, at least, of different levels. You definitely have the relationship between humankind and artificial intelligence having been created by human beings, but then gaining their independence from human beings and then potentially becoming superior to human beings and posing a threat to the continued existence of human beings. And so how do you deal with this relationship of creator and creation, especially when the creation surpasses the creator and has more power than the creator? But then you kind of have commentary about this process going on the level of the artist and his or her art, with the figure of John Keats kind of reincarnated, or not really reincarnated, but basically John Keats himself sort of makes an appearance in these books through an AI construct. I'll leave it at that. And so there's a lot of commentary about writing poetry, also through one of the seven pilgrims in Hyperion, who is a poet from Old Earth. So there's a lot of discussion about being a poet. What does being a poet mean? What does writing mean? What does the act of creation entail for the human psyche, for the relationship between the individual and society, and things like that? And lots of parallels are drawn to creating art, creating the AIs, the creation of the universe by God potentially as well. So this is reflected and developed on several different levels. So it's very rich. It's a very interesting theme for several different reasons. I mean, it can have a very practical aspect, but it also has a more metaphysical, spiritual aspect. And you can approach it in whichever way you prefer, really. There's also a big theme about stagnation versus progress or change and or human evolution, because it's often remarked upon that with human beings settled on their different planets, being able to instantaneously travel from a planet to another through the Farcaster portal system, human beings have become a bit complacent too comfortable with the help of technology and the AIs and the over-reliance of human beings on the AIs, and from creators having become a bit slave-like in a way, actually. And so this means that humankind as a whole has been stagnating for a couple hundred years. There hasn't been any major scientific innovation, artistic innovation, whereas the Ousters, this other big branch of humanity, has changed a lot to survive in the most hostile environment you can imagine, which is outer space, and using technology to create these amazing artificial environments so they can kind of travel between planets, travel between the stars, and even going so far as to radically change their own human biology. I guess the point is given more towards change and progress and evolution or revolution, and that stagnation overall is bad. Though stagnation isn't confused with conservation, because I would argue as well that there's a strong stance for ecological conservation and ecological harmony and things like that, but I'll get to that in a second. But mostly through the lens of being too dependent on AI, which I think is incredibly relevant to society today. I mean, it's been relevant ever since science started helping humanity significantly to have a more easy life. Nothing wrong with that in and of itself, we're all agreed, but I think you can question whether we aren't becoming too reliable in a certain respect on certain kinds of technologies. And so, like I said, there's also a strong message for ecological conservation, a balanced relationship between humanity and the natural world and other life forms, whether they be sentient or not. I mean, there are lots of examples given of planets where the ecosystems were absolutely destroyed once the planet became part of the hegemony and tourists started flooding en masse to these planets, with one planet being the main example and it being central to one of the pilgrims' stories. It was very moving, but this only kind of crept up towards the end of Hyperion and then is much more prominent in the fall of Hyperion, and you're like, yeah, okay, this is definitely an environmentalist message. Wow, this is pretty powerful. But I really like that. And of course, there's a strong critique, in my opinion, of consumerism and perhaps even overpopulation, because there are a lot of human beings in this hegemony, and the problem isn't so much the individual population of each planet, but the fact that so many people can go at once through Farcaster portals to other planets. So I said there was this main planet called Maui Covenant, and at first it was colonized by a group of humans from Hawaii, or at least human beings who wanted to live harmoniously with nature. And so they went to this planet and they lived fairly harmoniously with dolphins and native aquatic life forms. But then that planet joined the hegemony and Farcaster portals were built, and millions upon millions of tourists flooded this planet and basically destroyed the native ecosystem. So it's a massive cautionary tale in that regard, and it was very moving. And then apart from these three major practical themes, I guess I'm going to now switch to more abstract and potentially spiritual themes. We're going to call them that. I think there's a motif of pain and suffering and what it means. What does pain mean? This is very relevant in Hyperion, especially because pain is central to every pilgrim's story, whether it be physical pain, intellectual pain, emotional pain, loss, pain, suffering, sin, perhaps a little bit. I mean, you do have a Catholic priest as one of the pilgrims, and Catholic religion has somewhat of a role to play in this story, but also then redemption, perhaps. And like I said, finding meaning in that pain, finding meaning in your life, and all the suffering you accumulated in your life. Does it actually mean anything, or can you create something meaningful out of it? I think that's going on in these books. There's also bit of commentary on the power, this is going to sound very cheesy, but basically the power of love, but love in its largest sense, just the thing, the mysterious thing that binds people together, or, people and other animals or whatever. So yeah, the thing that binds us together, the sense of loyalty, a sense of community, the drive towards life and celebrating life with those you love around you, and family and friendship. It's perhaps more subtle and more diffuse in these books than the other themes I've mentioned. Well, I definitely think it's there. And I mean, there's a pretty obvious passage in the Fall of Hyperion to do with love, and love being equated to basically being the substance of the universe. So it gets very spiritual, but I thought it was very beautiful and it really spoke to me, so I wanted to mention it. And then, of course, really getting into metaphysical, potentially spiritual territory, the nature of consciousness, which, I mean, you can think about via the AIs, the cybrids, and the human beings, and then potentially other sentient life forms which were largely wiped out by colonizing human beings. And then the nature of God. Because again, without getting into spoiler territory, there's a lot of discussion about what exactly God is, or could be, or might become in the future. What exactly do we mean when we say God? What's the relationship of God to the universe, to humanity? How does consciousness and individuality factor in the possibility of something like God existing? And it's not something that's banged over your head. I think it's done very well. In fact, I would argue it really gets to something which is fairly pantheistic, which is definitely my preference. But you definitely have discussion of God from a more traditional standpoint via the Catholic priest character, or via the Church of the Shrike. Then just very abstract considerations of God through the AIs, because they might have their own God, perhaps. So God, consciousness, the self, the soul. It's central to the story, but again, it's just perhaps a bit more diffuse than some of the other themes that I mentioned. And it's not as massive and domineering as, well, domineering might be a bit pejorative, but just dominant as the discussion of institutionalized religion is in, for example, the Doomverse Chronicles. It's more spiritual and subtle overall. And before I get to my concluding remarks, I'm going to do something which I haven't actually done in a while. I'm going to read some quotes from both Hyperion and The Fall of Hyperion. Besides, a history viewed from the inside is always a dark, digestive mess, far different from the easily recognizable cow viewed from afar by historians. Here is the essence of mankind's creative genius, not the edifices of civilization, nor the bang-flash weapons which can end it, but the words which fertilize new concepts like spermatozoa attacking an ovum. What happened to a world when it went from a home for 100,000 humans in delicate balance with a delicate ecology to the playground for more than 400 million in the first standard decade of citizenship in the hegemony? Answer: the world died, or its soul did, even as the ecosphere continued to function after a fashion. Sol remembered the dream, remembered his daughter's hug, and realized that in the end, when all else is dust, loyalty to those we love is all we can carry with us to the grave. Faith, true faith, was trusting in that love. Pain is the curl and foam of a wave that does not break. Man and his machine intelligences, which is a parasite on the other? Neither part of the symbiote can now tell, but it is an evil thing, a work of the anti-nature. Worse than that, Duré, it is an evolutionary dead end. There is a certain solipsism to serious illness, which claims all of one's attention as certainly as an astronomical black hole seizes anything unlucky enough to fall within its critical radius. Where religious values might be relative, intellectual values fleeting, moral values ambiguous, and aesthetic values dependent upon an observer, the existence value of anything is infinite, and being infinite, equal to every other thing and all truths. Sometimes, said General Morpurgo, taking her hand, dreams are all that separate us from the machines. Love, that most banal of things, that most cliched of religious motivations, had more power, Sol now knew, than did strong nuclear force, or weak nuclear force, or electromagnetism or gravity. Love was these other forces, Sol realized. The void which binds, the subquantum impossibility that carried information from photon to photon, was nothing more or less than love. There was room for some sort of God, not in the web between the walls, nor in the singularity cracks in the pavement, nor somewhere out before and beyond the sphere of things, but in the very warp and woof of things, evolving as the universe evolved, learning as the learningable parts of the universe learned. In conclusion, I loved the first arc of the Hyperion Cantos. This, to me, was top tier, top quality science fiction / science fantasy. I preferred it to Dune, like I already said, though the first Dune trilogy remains excellent in my opinion as well. It was very well written, rich in its theming, interesting and convincing in its world building, emotionally impactful in its character work. So yeah, no major complaints really. I guess I would have enjoyed additional details and explanations, which I guess I could technically get in Endymion and or The Rise of Endymion if I ever decide to read those. But I was so happy with the way most of the character and narrative arcs concluded and got resolved that I want to stay on that happy, satisfied note. I don't want to risk it with the second arc. In any case, I've read 2 out of the 3 big works of epic science fiction. I haven't read Foundation. I don't really want to read Foundation because, I don't know, I had an ambiguous experience with the entirety of the Duneverse Chronicles. I had a great experience with the Hyperion Cantos. I don't know what I would make of Foundation. But so yeah, very happy with the Hyperion Cantos. I would most definitely recommend its first arc in any case, so Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion. And yeah, made me think, made me feel, made me care. I tore through those pages, which is always the hallmark of excellent literature. Which brings me to the end of my dual review for Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. I hope you found it informative, made you want to pick up those books if you haven't read them already. If you have read them, please do share your thoughts, opinions in the comments down below. I hope you will have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer, and I shall see you reasonably soon in the next video. Bye bye!